Hi, I'm Lee Milan. In this video, we're going to look at Ableton Live's frequency shifter device. So I'm just going to load in frequency shifter first before we explain what it actually can do to our audio signals. So frequency shifter does one of two different types of processing. Frequency shifting, which is basically we take the signal coming in and we add a certain amount of hertz, so frequencies, to the signal. So we either transpose it up in hertz or down. The other thing it can do is ring modulation, which is a different aspect of taking the input signal and then doing a different type of maths with it to give a new output signal. So we'll focus on frequency shifting first. So to explain exactly what's going on and how it affects our sound, what I've done is I've loaded in an operator which is producing a 100 hertz sine wave. Okay, so this is basically so the math is quite easy for what we're going to do. Now, if I go to the coarse frequency control of frequency shifter and I type in 100 hertz, it's now changed the 100 hertz signal and then added 100 hertz to it, and now it's a 200 hertz signal as well. So if I add 200 hertz to it, we're going to get a 300 hertz signal. Okay, so that's all simple in the respect that one frequency going in can be, pitched up or down in terms of frequency. But what's happening is just the maths of frequency is being added or subtracted from the input signal. What it's not taking into account is the more musical transposition, which is where we want to retain certain parts of a frequency to retain their musicality. So if I go for something that's a bit richer in its tone, so let's add in some additional pitch information to this. I'll just turn frequency shifter off and I'm adding in a 200 hertz signal. And then I'm going to go to here and I'm going to add in a 400 hertz. And then we'll add in a 500 hertz here as well. So 800 hertz. So they're all in octaves. So let's do the same thing we did before. We're going to add 100 hertz. Now, if we have a signal at 100 hertz and we add 100 to it, it becomes 200. And from a musical point of view, that becomes an octave above. If you take that 200 and we add 100 to it, it will take it to 300 hertz, but it's not an octave above at that point. It's a different musical interval. We'd have to add double the amount. So 100 hertz plus 100 hertz is 200. That's the first octave. 200 doubling it plus 200 is the next octave. Then 400 when we add 200 and 200 together, plus another 400 is 800, and that's the next octave too. And that's why I've set these operator sine waves to be stacked in that respect. So from a musical point of view, when we do frequency shifting, if we add 100 hertz, which we know will change that fundamental, that lower frequency, it will make it an octave up. It's not necessarily going to have the right maths for all the additional frequencies in this sound. So instead, that 200 hertz will become 300 hertz. That 400 will become 5, and that 800 will become 9 because we're just adding 100 to the whole signal. So I'll do a slow increment. So the timbre is actually changing. The relationship from a musical point of view of those four pitches inside that sound, those four frequencies, their separation from a musical point of view is becoming distorted. They're losing their integrity in terms of being harmonically related. So if you want to pitch, let's say, a synthesizer or a vocal, or we want to pitch it up and make it sound musical when we do it, we want to use a musical transposer, so a pitch transposing unit. If you want to do something more sort of sound designing or get something more metallic and discordant, frequency shifting is what we want to do, because we're going to break that association of the signal having its nice harmonic information and make it a little bit more sort of dissonant and metallic sounding. So frequency shifting is useful for things like drums, where we want to pitch them up, but we maybe want to make them sound a bit more metallic at the same time. It's also useful for doing very slight modifications to the property of the wet signal, and then we mix it alongside the dry signal and we'll get like a moving, phasing, or a pulsing, detune kind of effect. So I'll show you those two in context. So let's just set the frequency shifter back to where it was. just go for a simple drum rack setup. Let's just find a sound that's quite low at this stage. Just sequence that in a touch. And then let's add a frequency shifter just to that sound. So I'm going to go to Audio Effects, Frequency Shifter, and drop it onto that tom. Okay, so if I go to the actual sample and we just do a transposition, you notice that as it goes up, it still sounds like the same tom, just playing higher. Whereas with frequency shifter, it sounds quite different. The character's changing. So the relationship of those frequencies is being changed. We get a different type of tonality out of that. So let's have a look at this from the synthesizer point of view of getting this detuned, moving kind of sound. So if I go for a typical kind of sawtooth sound, we just go for a low-pitched note. We play that. Add our frequency shifter to there. Okay, so ever so slightly pitch that up. So it's going up in pitch, but it's also having a slight change to the harmonics that are in there, those frequencies that create the tone of what we're listening to. Then I'm going to change the dry wet. So we have the original and then the wet version, which to our ears won't sound that different yet, but it's a touch different than the source, and we'll get some interaction between those two signals together. Okay, so it's kind of like a detune of a synth, as I mentioned, and it's also got movement to it as those two things that are really close to being identical are slightly off and they start beating. They start fighting each other, and we have a kind of rhythm aspect of it too. So we have a coarse control here, which is the frequency coarse control for frequency shifting. Then we have the fine control, which gives us an easier adjustment. If we press the wide button, what actually happens is we have a pitch difference between the right and the left of the signal now. So I'll play it without the wide enabled, and then I'll play it with it enabled. Okay, so that's one way we can get more kind of movement to a sound using a detune effect, and also how we can do it to percussive sounds and give them a different character as well as pitch them up in terms of getting them higher in the register. So let's have a look at the kind of science aspect again of ring modulation this time, and then we'll have a look at some of the modulator aspects of the frequency shifter device. So if we just switch it into ring mode this time, and I'll set it to be that initial sine wave again. Okay, so we have that 100 Hertz frequency just on its own. Okay, now what a ring modulator does is it does a different type of maths, as I mentioned earlier on. So rather than just adding or taking away from it and moving the content up or down by numbers and adding or subtracting frequencies to it, what a ring modulator does is says, okay, you're giving me 100 Hertz. The actual oscillator that's inside the ring modulator, if I set that to, let's say, 50 Hertz, it's going to give us an output of two calculations. It's going to give us the sum, which is basically the signal going into the ring modulator alongside the pitch that the ring modulator makes itself. The sum of those added together will be one of the signals that we hear, and then the subtraction of those two numbers, so 100 Hertz from my operator instrument, and then 50 Hertz from my ring modulator, will then have a frequency that's representative of if you take those two away from each other. So remember, I've got 100 Hertz running in. My ring modulator is set to 50 Hertz. So the sum of those two is 150 Hertz. Now the difference between those two is 100 minus 50. So we'll have 50 Hertz. So we'll have a signal of 150 and a signal of 50 once it goes through. So I'm going to play it set to dry, and then I'll set it to wet so you can see and hear the new tones that the Ring modulators add into our sound. So there you see, 50 Hz and 150 Hz are the two new frequencies being made. Now this is a pure sine wave, so a ring modulator or even frequency shifting at this point with just some pure kind of tones, maybe it's a couple of kind of harmonics in there, can be quite useful for basic sound design stuff. But as soon as you start throwing way more complex sounds into this, you can really transform sounds from what they were into something quite new and quite exotic sounding. So let's go for a different type of sound source now. So I'm just going to go to Sounds. And let's just go for like a string sound, actually. I think that'll work well to show how these two different types of processors can really distort, and I mean like change the association of the musicality of the sound that you're passing through. Get our frequency shifter on now. And let's set it to ring modulation. So we still have the way that the pitch goes up and down from the notes from the source instrument, but you can hear as soon as I go to the fully wet signal, it's now become something that sounds like kind of scraped metal or banged metal instead of the actual musical sound in the beginning point. So we have the same options in terms of what we can alter here. So I can change the pitch of the internal oscillator inside the ring modulator, the thing that it bases its maths around. So let's see what that sounds like. So when you get to the very lower frequency rates of the ring modulator, you get more of a tremolo effect, also to the point where it's fast enough that the rate of the volume going up and down actually distorts the waveform itself. So where it would normally do a single cycle, it chops the audio up and down in volume while the cycle's still in the middle of its first kind of repeat, and you get what we call amplitude distortion. Tremolo up to amplitude distortion. And then we get to the point where new tones are really added to this, those metallic tones. Watch your ears when you're doing this. When you go into the high registers, it can get quite piercing, so keep your volume levels down. And then we've got the spread control again, which will pitch up to the right and pitch down on the left, so we get a much wider stereo sound. So these are very opposing kind of phase sensations. So be careful with this in terms of how much you use. Maybe apply the dry wet so you don't fully have just the ring modulated sound. Because when things are completely opposite in terms of the frequencies on the left and the right, it sounds massive, but when you make the actual mix of your song in mono, a lot of it gets lost. So it's something you use with kind of subtle amounts in terms of the wide control. Okay, so the final thing to talk about in terms of the actual processing side before we talk about the modulation is this drive control. Now, it's not available on the frequency shifter, it's just available as a good way of getting a bit more power out of sound that you've ring modulated. So that will just allow me to turn up the kind of intensity of the sound. And again, let's just counteract that on the actual, the audio track itself and just turn that down a little bit. Now in context, just that note and those kind of musical, the pattern doesn't sound particularly enticing, but the tone of it's quite interesting. So I'm just going to play one note now. And becomes a bit more like a big, impactful stab type of sound that you can use instead. So always adapting. It's quite experimental when you're doing this ring modulation and frequency modulation, but it does allow you to get some new sounds out of this. So the last thing that we need to cover is the LFO, or the modulation side of this, where we can make things, or parameters, move inside the unit. So we have an LFO amount. So if we turn that up, so I've got a very slow LFO at the moment, and what it's doing is taking the values of my hertz for the ring modulator right now, and it's just slowly pulling up the value and then slowly pulling down the value. So it's a good way, if you, especially in subtle amounts of the LFO, to just get slight change to the sound over time. So maybe you can get on with the rest of the things you're doing in your song, and if this is a background sound, it can just have ever so slight changes to it as it goes. Now, what it's doing at the moment is it's doing a opposite LFO for the left and the right, sorry, the right and the left. So as one goes up, the other goes down. It's 180 degrees completely out of phase. We can align those. So the LFO is universal on the left and the right, so things are more uniform. But if you want to create even more stereo information, the phase control is a good way to get separate peaks and troughs on the right-hand side to the left in terms of what this LFO is doing to our processing. The final thing we have is the spin control, which is basically, if we have, let's say, the speed of the right LFO, which is doing the right-hand processing, and the left, and they're both in unison, the spin basically sets one to be slightly faster and one to be slightly slower. So you get this sense of stereo movement as well. So what we've done is we've looked at frequency shifting and ring modulation using Ableton Live's frequency shifter device. We've had a look at how the actual maths of it works when we introduce just a single frequency, which has a nice rounded number, so we can kind of calculate how it works. And then we've looked at creative applications of how we can apply that to create some different types of sounds for our music making.